Okay, so welcome everybody to Maths Part 2. This is all about teaching and modelling how to make comparisons and connections in a mathematical context. Obviously, helping children with this in maths is helping them with their thinking capabilities across the board. So last time we covered particularly the stages of counting. We looked at subitizing, which is seeing amounts without counting. And we also talked about the connection between the numeral and the amount and how important it is that children understand the notion of amounts and what numerals actually stand for. We also spoke about the importance of having a variety of really interesting objects to handle. Those might be found natural objects. They might be lovely shiny counters. They might be stones that you have put dots on. Variety of things. Just interesting to have fiddly things to handle, and remembering those children who prefer to be outside might need really large objects to move about. Planning intentionally the vocabulary you need to teach so children can explain their mathematical thinking, and all of your practitioners, whether you're in a small setting or a larger setting, you want everybody to be really fluent with the type of language that you'll be using for each of the strands of maths. And very importantly, we want to be noticing how children are thinking mathematically. So bearing those things in mind, was there anything from the last session that you implemented or you would recommend, or something you tried that was not recommended but makes a link with number and counting and one-to-one correspondence? This is your chance to share what you were able to do, because I obviously did not cover everything, but it may be that there was one idea that you thought, I'm going to try this. Most of the activities you could implement pretty much straight away. Let me just have a look. You're welcome to write in the chat or to just come off mute. We're quite a small group, so I'm happy for you to chip in. Do interrupt me, but what I was going to do is perhaps share from the last training. So we had another training session at 12:30, and the participants there were saying that they were having a go at teaching the children subitizing. So just having a go at drawing their attention to seeing an amount of objects, just having a look and noticing if the children were saying, here, I've brought you 2 bananas, or maybe as part of their role play. And one setting, we're finding that the children were coming along with their subitizing, and the other setting felt that they needed to do a bit more work on it and perhaps find a way for it to be led by the children, rather than the children be put off by it being a slightly out of reach activity for them. So from that, we can learn that it's really important to follow the child from where they're at. So really noticing what they're able to understand and building from there. So here we have the same little image from the previous session of children who are playing a really simple 3-in-a-row game where there are multiple opportunities to notice that two are next to each other, to notice the difference between the bamboo cylinders and the circles or the slices of the wood. And that actually really exemplifies this next approach really, really well, because there are lots of comparisons that can be made whilst playing the game. So we're going to look at the fourth approach that's recommended by the EEF for teaching mathematical development. And that is teaching and modeling how to make comparisons and connections. So it's really about building on the counting and the one-to-one correspondence. Once they're understanding that, once they're getting the order of the count correct, then it's time to start building on that and make comparisons and make connections and draw attention to numbers within numbers, for example. So we'll look at examples of this approach in action, a bit like this picture here that we have. And then we'll look at examples of planning for groups and how we might plan for language specifically over a week, say, and how that might look. So some very practical examples that might be helpful in your practice, and how to continue providing opportunities to practice these ideas in the continuous provision. So all of these games that we'll be looking at are resources that can then be left in the continuous provision. You've shown them how to play a game in a particular way, and then by leaving that out in the continuous provision, you can see whether the children go back to it, use it in the same way, in a similar way, start making up their own game. So I hope these provide a lot of ideas for you to take away. So if you're looking at the evidence store for mathematics, for early mathematics in the EEF website, you'll see that the fourth approach that they recommend for supporting children in developing their mathematical understanding is teaching and modeling how to make comparisons and connections. Now, if you click on there, you'll then be taken to the page explaining in detail. I've cut and pasted part of that. You keep scrolling down and then you'll come across some videos. I have not included videos in this presentation. I've included lots of photographs that I'll narrate through. Sometimes videos are a little bit faint and hard to hear, but I recommend you go to the site and see those approaches in action. What they do is they break down the approaches into little bits. So they very specifically show you this is this practice in action. So each approach has several practices, like comparing, like copying. It might be very specifically narrating back a child's language in a correct form, which we use in communication and language as well. So this is what the approach 4 is all about. The research is saying that using activities such as block building, arranging objects in order of size, location, position can be effective. Activities such as identifying the odd one out or comparing sets of objects to talk about more and fewer is also effective. And other effective activities that were found in the research were using weighing scales, where they're making comparisons of weight, and using ordinal numbers, where they're using comparisons of position. So you might want to introduce some ordinal numbers that are physical and can be held, or you might just use your numerals, if you have any large numerals, and use the language first, second, and third, and incorporate that in a racing game, for example. This was a really nice image of these very simple blocks. They're ancient. We didn't throw them away, we inherited them. And this child managed to use a mixture of foam blocks, outlast community, outdoor blocks, and these smaller blocks. And you can see that there's so much going on. The richness of this activity is incredible. And at one point, he managed to make it even taller than himself. So then he was making a comparison between his height and the height of the construction. Obviously, this doesn't happen overnight. Making such a tall construction takes time. You really have to draw attention to all of the children about the importance of somebody's personal building that they've created or their wall. We always have that child who likes to knock things over. You develop a culture of respect in the space where over time even that child knows not to knock over. And where this is unavoidable, you have a lovely team who can build it up again without there being too many tears shed. So another quote from the EEF approach is around teaching connections, and then and all of the practitioners involved planning their activities really carefully. So this is all about scaffolding the learning. So knowing how to break the learning right down. And I've used this image as an example of breaking an activity down because there is so much going on here. We have a text that is about going to market and putting in an amount of fruits in a basket. And then we have the bean bags that not only have the numeral, they have the word, and they also have the dot, which gives an opportunity for some subitizing in an almost abstract way. So it takes us from the concrete to the recording in an abstract way. It's the halfway between. But all you're doing here, if you're working with very, very young children, is you're exposing them to these visuals. And then you have the real objects with the 5 frame, which is very tactile, it's inviting. Children of diverse needs and interests and abilities will be attracted to participate when there are all these varieties of equipment. So they talk about breaking down tasks into manageable steps, tailoring the learning to suit the children from where they are in their learning journey. And finally, they talk about encouraging adults to be involved in the mathematical learning of the children. And we know that many adults have had not the best experience with maths. Some have been very lucky and have really joyful early experiences of maths. But by providing playful, joyful games for parents, we're enabling them to make a reconnection with their mathematical learning and hopefully present some joy and love and interest to their children. Because we know the cycles sometimes of negativity are very easily reproduced without us even noticing. So lovely that the EEF research has shown that that parental involvement is really, really key in helping support. So simply, if you invent a game or you come across a beautiful book that supports mathematical learning, share it with your families. So in this particular activity, you might be seeing that the child is handling the objects and they're placing them in the 5 frame, and you're building on what they're doing rather than saying, okay, I can see you've got 1 in there. How many have you got left? This might not be appropriate for your youngest children. Your pre-verbal child might give you lots of information about what they're able to do by the way they manipulate. But remember to step back, give them time. What you've done is you've limited the objects available. So there is only a limited way in which they can manipulate and use them. But here you've got all the resources necessary to build on and scaffold and provide the next challenge. What you can also do with this resource is use it as a storytelling prop situation. So as you're telling the book, you are using the props to reinforce the maths that comes across in the book. And this could be a really good way to entice the child who doesn't like coming to sit for a book. That might be the interest that they need, that they've got something to handle and something to touch. So, oops, sorry, didn't mean to skip that one so quickly. So, typical ways to teach this approach. This again is cut and pasted from the EEF, and it talks about the practices, the commenting, the prompting, the gesturing to draw attention to similarities, differences, and sequences. And here I've used an image I've used before of very young 2-year-olds who are handling quite sensory objects that are presented to them on a larger scale with a larger numicon, which provides a bit of a frame in which for them to divide these objects up. So in doing so, they're doing something incredibly mathematical. And we might draw attention to the similarities there and to the differences. But what better question to ask than what can you see? And from there, you can build on what the child has given you. So, for example, an educator could comment how 2 tiers of bricks compare in terms of height. And we'll look in a moment at a game where they might be able to create those towers. And so another thing they said they saw in the research that educators were demonstrating how to break down shapes or numbers into parts. Now, when they say numbers, they mean objects or groups of objects, amounts, because obviously you're not going to start tearing apart a 2, but what they mean there are the amounts. So educators should reflect on how they can use the approach and practices both during adult initiated and child initiated. So that awareness of how important it is to use both adult-led and child-led. They don't say the ratio, the old ratio that we used to stick by of 80 to 20 is not necessarily recommended. I still have that in the back of my mind because it supports me in making sure that the adult directed doesn't take over and that the adult supported is not marginalized. So the practices are commenting, emphasis, thinking aloud, imitation, making links, composing and decomposing. And what this image is about is that composition and that decomposition. So very, very young children, again, these children are 2, are given some objects to manipulate. With younger children, I would suggest doing the same, but just providing fewer objects. They might be taking handfuls of things, and that's fine as well. These ones, we're drawing a bit more attention to the amounts of things that they're taking. There's quite a lot of collaboration going on here as well, because they're starting to learn how to work in a group like this. They're not forced to come here. They have come because they're intrigued by the different resources and the way I've laid them out. So they want to come and participate and show me the art that they can make. And some of them made quite symmetrical art. So we were able to make comparisons between each other's compositions. So if we look at our curriculum and how we want to plan for the exposure of different areas of mathematics, and the National Centre of Excellence for the Teaching of Mathematics calls those strands. It's really useful to look at their documentation. And here I'm sharing their progression chart, which is for composition. It's about 5 or 6 pages long. This is just the first page. And we use this to help us grid out how we wanted to teach composition over the 6 weeks of one of our half terms. So this is what we thought would be helpful. So in the first column, we wrote down the types of activities that we wanted to be doing and what it is that we wanted to expose the children to. In the second column, you've got what the 2-year-olds might be doing as an activity. And this is a working document. So we change these as and when we think actually another activity worked better to teach the same thing. And then in the third column, you've got what the 3 to 4-year-olds were doing. So what I did was just took an example of maybe this third week. So you'd be building on from identifying smaller numbers within a number. So again, we're talking about seeing an amount within an amount. So if you have 5 tangerines and you put 1 in your frame, then you've got 4 left in your basket. Interesting to note if the child notices the 1 or the 4 or disregards one of those amounts, and you can draw attention to the fact that we still have 5 altogether. So then they develop that idea of conservation, that we can divide it up into 2 amounts, but altogether we haven't taken any away, we haven't put any in, and so the amount stays the same. And that relates to inverse operations. So if you're allowing children to handle objects in that way, they will start to comprehend that the 1 and the 5 can also be presented as, well, maybe if we put 4 in the 5 frame, then we would only have 1 in the basket. But they need to handle objects many times to discover that and to have that reinforced through concrete objects before we start saying things like 1 and 4 makes 5. I know people like to jump to that with their fingers and show it, but it's really important you do that with the handling of the objects as well, because not all children become very fluent in the use of their fingers. You've got to have the first stage really, really carefully practiced and enjoyed. So if we looked at the third week, where you're saying a number can be partitioned into pairs of numbers, the activity you might do with the younger children is you might put things into 2 containers in different ways. So a bit like the 5 frame and the basket, or you might have 2 baskets, or you might even have double-sided counters or beans where one side is colored, throw the collection, and then see how many of each type you can see. So if you've got 5 beans, one side is black and one side is white, you will say how many black did we have and how many white and how many have we got all together, and you'll say, oh wow, actually there is still 5. It doesn't change. No matter how we throw it, we've still got the same total amount, but the amounts in it changes, and that's really fun and interesting for the children to discover. And with the older children, like using the fingers, you might do that with your bunny ears. So you might, with 2 hands, show me 5 fingers, but you need to use 2 hands. So you're setting them a challenge, and there might be a reason for that within your game. Can you do it in a different way? Show 5 fingers all together with a friend. So you might say each friend can only use 1 hand, but you need to show me 5. That's your challenge. Off you go. 1, 2, 3. Let's see. So you can make up all sorts of little games. But if you're planning something out in this way, it's really recommended for that third week. So if you go 3 down, you say, okay, these are the questions I want to be asked, and these are the types of words we want. So with the youngest children, we might say, how many are in each plate? 2 different sides, specifically using those words. We still have the same amount. So every practitioner is getting used to using the word amount the same. We still have, it stays the same. And then the slightly older ones, we might say, how many of each? The total amount stays the same. Now, I know this sounds a bit clunky, but it really is worth being really specific about the type of language you're using. And that doesn't mean you're eliminating all the other rich language that you use around numbers and counting and height and weight. But what you're doing here is you're making sure that over the year, you've been intentional about the exposure to every single strand in maths, rather than just letting it be haphazard. So when you plan for each area, you may have some texts that you've used over time that are really fun. And my favorite one here is actually the 10 black dots. It's really simple. It shows them arranged in different ways. It helps develop subitizing really simply. But this is just a collection of books that really help support composition and comparison. Sorry, I was in the middle of saying comparative and composition language, or composition and comparison. So how might this look outside? Well, let's make sure that we're providing really large objects and natural objects that make sense to be outside. I said it's really important to have little fiddly things. I recommend that little counters and gems and marbles do not come outside, because they often will end up down drain holes, or they might just get lost behind things and buried in soil. So it's really advisable to have your indoor objects and your outdoor objects that are quite specific to the areas. But make sure there are fun things to discover. So here we've got some plums from a tree that is on our forest school site, and they're really fun to manipulate and discover. And that gives the children a chance to see really large amounts. These big logs were really heavy, so the child was only able to move one at a time and really feel the weight of each of those. But the sticks, for example, he could take clumps of and take those much, much more easily. So already there's that noticing that the one object that's heavy, you can only carry one of, but you're able to carry many more of smaller objects. So the job of the adult there is commenting on the weight and asking I wonder questions, such as, I wonder how you're going to get this from here to there. It's so heavy that you only managed to take 3 steps. You might have to do it in 2 goes. So you've got so many opportunities to reinforce language. I've just noticed that one of the G's ended up on the other side. Sorry about that. You will get these slides. If you feel I've rushed through some of them, you'll be able to go back and have a look at them in more depth. This is a bit out of focus, but I really did like it as an example, because a practitioner here had very creatively set up some outdoor twigs in the indoor environment, so bringing the natural to the inside, and provided these measuring sticks made from Unifix cubes, which really did entice the children to come in and have a go at measuring. I'm going to skip actually, because this is the example of the child coming to measure. So he's seeing how many bricks high it is. He's maybe comparing one stick to another and able to say, oh, this one is 3 bricks shorter. But always remember, where a child is struggling with something like this and walking away from it because showing the measure point might be a bit too tricky for them, the first stage might be to give them one of the sticks and say, can you go around and find things that are the same length? Finding the same length is easier than identifying a given length on a longer measuring stick. So if I go back, this was the example, other way. This was the example of the 1 minute towers. So this was a group of about 11 children in a key worker group making some towers. So they've all got lots and lots of resources. There's no need to squabble for resources because there are so many of them piled in the middle of the space. It's a mixed ability group, so they're differentiated by outcome. I've given them the instruction that it's easier to do this on their knees because that way they're not knocking over their towel with their feet. Some were able to follow these instructions. Others, it was a bit too early for them to process that and manage that, but they still participated and were able to make smaller towers, but were still fully involved. So you might be talking about which is the tallest tower, which is the shortest tower, which are the towers that are the same. You might even start making comparisons between the height of 2 of the tallest ones, for instance, or 2 of the shortest ones. So here I've given an example of children collaborating and working things out together. So much learning goes on between peers. If you provide challenges where you're saying, I'd like you to work together, then you give them an idea of something that they can do in their continuous provision, and that you find that they will replicate these sessions in their own continuous provision. So you're giving them an opportunity to organize themselves or play teacher. In this one on the left, we're looking at children who have been asked to only take 5 cubes. Then they have a 10 frame, and together they're going to arrange their 5 cubes and then talk about what they can see. So they might talk about having 2 yellow and 8 of a different color, or they might divide it up into more groups than that. And you will provide the resources that are appropriate for your age of children. So you might only provide 2 colors of bricks because you don't want them to get too confused with the groups within the larger amount. So that's your call to scaffold down and to break down into the various steps. And on the right here, we have very simple straws that have been cut up in equal length, and children are arranging those to see if they can make a perfect square. And there's all sorts of language that can come out of that. And this is to exemplify also how you can make a 2D shape that is not, you cannot pick up a 2D shape. You're creating a space that is that shape in a very simple, affordable way. And this is another way that you can create 2D shapes just by, this is electric tape that children were cutting up and arranging on the carpet, and they were really fascinated that they could keep moving these in different ways. It isn't something that you could keep for ages, but if on some baking paper, you can put this, or on some acetate, you can put these sticky bits and maybe keep them for 2 or 3 days. And that kept their attention for a really long time, and it was very simple. And it had come from the interest of a child who was making things in the junk modeling area, and they'd started arranging bits And so then I provided a bit more for them and then asked them if they could make different shapes using these lines. And here we have a really nice example of some resources that really lend themselves to being counted, to filling up the space. So these blocks fit beautifully inside these crates, which was really helpful for reinforcing the idea of shape and filling, because they're creating oblongs here. And there's so much collaboration going on with this task that they were quite repetitive about, actually, over a few days. Arranging, moving. It's a really nice way to slow down the movements of our transporters and giving them slightly larger objects to transport so that they're slowing down their thinking as well. So, how do we help children organize their thoughts? One of the big things we can do is really help them slow down their thinking. So those flitty children, maybe we give them larger things to do in an outdoor environment, that just by the fact that those things are heavy slows down their movements. Something to think about. So again, here we've got the 10 frames and the 5 frames you might use. You might use egg boxes to arrange amounts. You might ask the children, what do you see? What do you notice? The child might say here, I notice 3 empties on that side and 3 empties on this side. They might say, I can see 3. What can you see 3 of? I can see 3 cubes on this side. This shows you something about how a child is thinking. Another child might say, I can see 4 blue cubes and I can see 1 red. And that's when you can say, but how many are there altogether? Does it matter that some are red and some are blue? You still have 5. So these are the types of words that you might use, taking real care that you are not saying that there is a right and a wrong about the way that they see things. You're validating what they can see and saying, yeah, I can see that. So opportunities for children to arrange, to take apart, to put back together. So we're building on the ideas that we looked at last time. And what I'd really like the key messages from this session to be around you going away and thinking about, perhaps over the summer, designing a maths curriculum for your setting and including as many stakeholders in your setting that you can. So you've got those differing views. And you might start with breaking things down into 3 sections, like the 3 trainings that we're providing. And then over time, you might want to build in the 6 strands that the National Centre of Excellence of Teaching Mathematics provide for us. But you need to be reflective about what will work in your setting. This is about you being evidence informed, knowing what the research is saying are good practices, and having a go at building those into what you are providing for your children. So consider what this looks like in small groups, and then how that might look in the continuous provision. And then you want to be planning precisely for the language that you want the children to be exposed to. Which mathematical language are you using each term? And then as you build confidence, you can break that down into weeks. But what's important is that you're showing that you are being reflective. And here is the link to the form for the next webinar that is around maths, which is about extending early years maths via executive functions and spatial skills. And we've designed these sessions so that there's not too much overlap, but there is enough to make really concrete connections. So it is all very holistic. And here are the links to the various areas that could be useful for you.